He hopes a new police commissioner enters in his district and sees his officers without a mask. But when a white policeman spits out his face and thinks he's not there, the whole room is just a little far away, so you can shine. It was on a Tuesday morning in August when newly appointed Police Chief Richard Nelson rose from his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small town hidden in the calm hills of North Carolina. With a simple checkered shirt, worn jeans, and worn sneakers, he saw no part of the man who rose to the ranks of law enforcement for 20 years. That was exactly what he intended. Richard believed that through the refined lens of planned meetings and greetings, he would see things about things they really didn't. As a black man who played a leadership role in a district plagued by whispers of misconduct, he wanted to observe the rewards of the department. How can you do that better than conclude yourself? The area's parking lot was summed up with officials. Richard Scan noticed the officers in the area and occasionally saw his path. It wasn't surprising that no one seemed to recognize him. His appointment was announced a few days ago, and he decided to make the public only to arrive at the official inspection late in the morning. He set the edge of his baseball cap and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission to eradicate toxicity in the department was pressed heavily against his shoulders. He wasn't used to resistance, but he knew this job would test him as he hadn't yet imagined. A weak sound of laughter carried through the air as he approached the building. Unnoticed under the sum of casual chatter and call calls, Richard stepped through the district entrance. The tiled soil glowed under hard fluorescent light, with the smell of old coffee hanging in the air. He went slowly and saw the dynamics around him. A group of officers were busy near the desk, exchanging some exchange stories and other verified documents. No one paid much attention to him until he stayed near the restroom. "Hey you!" Sharp sound passing through noise. Richard began to give him a white officer, a comfortable laugh on his face. His badge, Officer Daniels. He leaned against the wall behind him, looking with interest. Richard opened his mouth and spoke, but Daniels didn't give him a chance. "You've lost it, right?" "This is not protection," the officer said. His sound dripped before the act. "You have to accept this confusion somewhere else." Richard froze. The words landed like a blow. I didn't know if he quickly corrected the man or continued to develop the scene. Before he could decide, Daniels approached, and his voice rose for the benefit of his audience. "Can't you hear it? Come out from here. We don't need people like you to wander around." Laughter erupted from the audience, and Richard collided with the beating of his jaw, his heart. He tried to speak, but Daniels leaned in and his face was bent. The officer then spits out Richard's face directly without warning. Time seemed to have stopped. Richard's breath climbed as warm saliva dripped down his cheeks. The laughter around him grew louder. The officer bumped into the table, doubled, and muttered something about someone else showing her place leaf luff. Richard's spirit raced. He could feel his pulse hitting his ears, but he kept his tranquility. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out his handkerchief and wipes his face, slowly and intentionally. "How does this treat everyone who passes through these doors?" Daniels laughs. "Only those who don't belong here." The group erupted again with laughter, but Richard said nothing. Instead, he turned and followed the hallways and left the officers as he went to the district headquarters. Intercom came to life and invited all employees to the briefing room. That was time. The briefing room was chatty when officials submitted it. Some were wearing coffee cups, while others laughed at the joke. Richard entered through the side door and had a folder now wearing the official district stickers. He stood outside his perspective, looking at the room filled with familiar faces. Some still laughed before the previous incident. In front of the room, Captain Harris, a strong man with a gray mustache, asked for an order. "Well, everyone, everything. I received an important introduction today." The officers calmed down and their curiosity was thrilled. Daniels leaned against the wall, a satisfying expression still painted over his arms, his face. The man clearly enjoyed the morning. Captain Harris cleaned his throat. As most of them know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We are waiting for his replacement and are pleased to present an impressive recording and vision for this department to our new guide. Richard began measuring his steps. As he went to the podium, the room froze and his presence appeared. He placed the folder on the speaker and slowly searched the room. His gentle appearance only heightened tension. From tomorrow's complaints, event reports, everything, you'll need to give a full assessment of Daniel's history on the desk. You understand that, Harris said, before hesitating. And the boss. I think you've shaken some of you today. In a good way. Richard hung up and allowed a brief moment of satisfaction before immersing in the pile of paper in front of him. The districts were different over the coming weeks. The officer, who once laughed at Daniels, avoided him overall. His suspension whispers spread across the department. Richard regularly walked through the hall and made his goal to say hello to everyone he had finished. His presence was a constant memory of his leadership. Some executives have taken change to heart. Officer Reyes, a young recruit, turns to Richard one day and admits that he was equipped with a toxic culture out of fear of retaliation. I want to do it more, boss, she said seriously. That's all I ask, Richard replied with his voice, but firm. It starts with you. But not everyone was ready to change. Daniels filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. Richard held his floor and was convinced that accountability was not an option. The department has revealed many previous complaints against Daniels. Daniels ranged from excessive violence to inappropriate comments. His appointment was denied, and Richard makes it clear that the era of cheating ended under the carpet. Despite progress, Richard knew the street would take us before us. The talk of implicit bias and community relations was filled with mixed reactions. But he wasn't upset. All the little victories of the speaking recruits were officials who covered his approach. One morning, Richard attended a joint event where he met a boy who looked embarrassed at him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his eyes surprised. "That's me," Richard said with a smile. "My dad says the police won't take care of us," the boy said. His voice was barely a whisper. Richard crouched down to see his eyes. "We cannot change the past, but we promise we are committed to making it better," he said kindly. "And if you need help, come to me. Is that okay?" The boy nodded, a slight smile breaking in his face. It was in these moments that reminded Richard why he accepted his job. By the end of the first year, the district was undoubtedly different, although not perfect. No officers who were unable to adapt were removed and replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for a fair and respectful department. The community once skeptical and began to see signs of change. One evening, Richard stood in the district's main hall to observe how the authorities submitted after their tier. Laughter and comrade felt realistic and inclusive rather than sacrifice others. He knew there were always challenges, but for the first time he felt hope. Change was never easy, but it was worth every fight. Daniel's smirk, the color that came out of his face as recognition lighted up. The other officers exchanged restless looks. Some whispered, others stared at Richard with big eyes. "Good morning," Richard stabilized his voice. "My name is Richard Nelson. Starting today, I am your new police chief." Silence was deafening. Daniel's face turned to his brave evaporation, a deep red shadow. Richard's gaze landed on him, lasting longer than necessary before rocking the rest of the room. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "what I saw was the opening of my eyes." A tweet cried out through the crowd, but Richard raised his hand to silence it. "In my short time here, I have already seen behavior that is not professional and barely acceptable. Let me clarify one thing. Culture that ends here ends today. The room remained incredibly calm, and the weight of his words sank. Daniels moved uncomfortably to the ground. Richard took a step closer to the edge of the podium. His sound was sharp but controlled. Respect is not an option. That is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement agencies. Without them, we not only fail, but the community we serve. He strolled around for a moment of silence and watched the officers blew the wind under his eyes. This morning, some of them laughed at the other helpless guys in their place. But let me remind you, everyone who passes through these doors deserves respect for whether or not they have a badge. His words sweep through the room like a blade. No one dared to move. Richard left silent, his gaze firmly. The tension in the room is obvious, and all officers know the weight of his words. Daniels moved again. His discomfort was evident when beads formed on his forehead. But Richard wasn't enough. "I understand that change is difficult," he said. His voice is stable, but he is caught up in authority. "But let me be clear. Whether you are a colleague, a civilian, or someone else, there is no tolerance for behavior that ignores the dignity of an individual." He left the podium and slowly went to the officers. His presence was ordered, but his tone was worn with controlled strength. "Officer Daniels," said Richard, staying a few meters away from the man. Daniels frowned, and his courage from the past completely disbanded. She continues, and Richard continues to block his eyes with him, representing everything that is broken in this department. "I wasn't the only one who didn't respond when you spit in my face. It was a badge, a vow, and a community we protected." Daniels stammered, "I didn't know." Richard paused, his voice sharply. "You were not interested in you. Standing up, it wasn't a problem. And this assumption is why this department has lost the trust of people." The room was quiet and all the policemen were frozen. Richard turned his attention to the rest of the group. "What I saw was not merely human mistakes. It was a culture where bullying and prejudice were not only tolerated, but also praised. And it stops now." He returned to the podium, his voice rising slightly. "I spent my career fighting not only on the streets, but also on the walls of departments like this. The change is not easy and does not occur overnight. But I promise you, as long as I am my boss, this district will work with integrity, respect, and accountability." Richard took a break and immersed his words. He then closed with a slight nod in comparison to Captain Harris. "And think once more among those who think this is nothing more than a wrist blow. This is the first of many changes." Buchan snaps the room for air. Daniel's face turned purple and his jaws widened as he avoided his colleague's eyes. Richard, who was not impressed, was big. "This is not about punishment," he said. "That's setting the standard. If you're not ready to stand up on it, this is not the place for you." He threw it into the room one last time, his eyes blocking it with all the officers. "If you are ready to be better, we will move forward together. But you know that. I hold you accountable at every stage of the road." The meeting ended with intense silence. Officers shuffle out of the room without the usual chatter. Richard stayed on the podium for a moment, seeing a mix of embarrassment and rage in his face, like Daniels had attacked. Other officers avoided eye contact, their expression from guilt to gentle contemplation. Back in his office, Richard sat at his desk and took a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning. The contaminated long-standing setting never changed overnight, and for some, it didn't change at all. However, he had not come to Blue Ridge to find friends. He started doing something. The phone rang at his desk. It was Captain Harris. "Boss, I wanted to say—" "They handled it better than most other people," Harris said. "Thank you, Captain," replied Richard. "But the actual work begins now."